Welcome, everybody, to Aeon Byte. Welcome to AB Live specifically. My name is Miguel Connor, and I am still your Pompatus of Gnosis. Welcome, everybody who's already here in the chat and anybody who is listening in as we speak. Very excited today to be joined again by Paul Levy to discuss his book, Undreaming Wetiko. Breaking the Spell of the Nightmare Mind Virus. Excellent book that I think you should definitely read it as part of his continuing journey with Wetiko. Paul, thank you very much for coming on the show again.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here with you, Miguel. Thank you so much.
Pleasure is all ours. And with us, too, we've got the Moondog Vance. Vance, how are you doing?
I'm just fine. I'm always up for a fight against the mind virus, so waiting to have at it.
Yeah, that's definitely been a theme of this show. And yes, for the audience, I see you in the chat room already streaming. Yeah, definitely streaming and running in there. As always, if you have any questions, we will try to get to them. Please super chat them so we can see them from the crowd. And yeah, let us know what you think. So, Paul, well, let's talk about this book. As you say, Wetiko is a dreaming phenomenon, which might surprise some people. And you also say it's the most important or the greatest evil. The greatest evil we are facing today. Tell us why Wetiko is dream now.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, what I mean is that, so what Wetiko is, it's a mind virus, it's a collective psychosis that we're in the middle of. I mean, I don't think there's any debate about that, that our species has fallen into this collective psychosis. And I'm pointing out, well, I can approach it from a number of different angles, but basically this experience we're all sharing on planet Earth is a shared collective dream. And I'm not just saying that as a theory. I began having this realization like 40 plus years ago, and I'm still deepening that understanding. But that being the deeper context, what I'm pointing out is that the collective insanity, this mind virus that we're in the middle of, that we are actually conjuring up, is a dreamed up phenomena that all of us are co-dreaming this insanity to materialize and play out in and as and through our life, or as the very universe itself, as it's manifesting in this way where we're destroying ourselves. We are unconsciously, maybe some people consciously are participating, or we're colluding, we're enacting our own collective suicide, and that there's no doubt about. And I'm pointing out that when people hear this mind virus, it sounds really woo-woo or new agey, but in essence, what I'm pointing out is that what I mean by a mind virus is that the origin of the collective madness and the solution is to be found within the human psyche. And that's a no-brainer. I mean, where else could our madness be found? And I'm pointing out that encoded in the madness, in the collective acting out, as we're killing ourselves and each other and the biosphere, the life support system of the planet, that encoded holographically hidden within our acting out, this insanity is the solution, that it's actually revealing something to us, that this mind virus is a revelation, but it's a revelation not from on high, not through the light like it was 2,000 years ago in one person, but this revelation is coming up through the underworld, through the darkness, and that there's something that's being shown to us that's most important for us to know. But if we don't recognize what's being shown to us through the collective acting out of our insanity, then we're doomed to just compulsively and unconsciously just continue to enact our own self-destruction,
Yeah, well said. Yeah, we had you on, I think it was early 2022, and I think things in a way have just gotten worse. The human psyche is fragmented. I know, obviously, people say, and it's statistically true, there's less poverty, natural disasters are causing less effect, people are living longer, people are richer. These are facts. Unfortunately, the facts is that suicide, mental illness, addiction, depression are just shooting up, and you see it today. Everybody seems to be projecting their shadow. Everything seems to be fragmenting, and I think of that interview where they had with Jung when he was talking about nature is no longer the danger, it's the psyche. It's the psyche that creates nuclear bombs.
Yeah.
We don't know ourselves, so we are creating a very dangerous collective psyche. I think we're there, right, Paul?
Yeah. Well, going back to Jung, he said a couple of other really, so yeah, he was pointing out, like you just shared, that the greatest danger that faces humanity is, collective psychosis, and that we hang by the thinnest of thread, and that thread is the human psyche. He also says a couple things really interesting. He talks about the sickness of our time, and he says it's a sickness of disassociation. And he actually describes that as the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And but he also points out that with this extreme disassociation, think about the polarization in our world, that it's actually a time of pregnancy, that something potentially is being given birth through that disassociation if we're able to navigate through it. But if not, like I'm saying, then we're doomed to destroy ourselves. He also says the problem of our times is that we don't understand what's happening in our world. And he clarifies by saying what's happening in our world is we're confronting face to face the darkness of the soul, the darkness of the unconscious. And but because we don't realize that the darkness that's playing out in our world is reflecting this parallel darkness within our soul, within our psyche, within our unconscious, then we keep the darkness out there and we try to, kill it or avoid it or whatever. And by doing that, we're unwittingly feeding into this mind virus.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Paul. I think one of the ill effects of our modern society is we decided that death was a horrible thing. We want to push death away and anything that's ugly to the margins, even though the ancients and the mystics see as a natural part of life, as it's just another state of existence, like when we dream. And we also want to push evil away. And in your book, you have the example of an individual who you respected and admired, and she went out and called you like a dualist because you dare focus on the dark. And do you think that's a problem too? We don't want to look at our shadows.
Yeah, well, this is my third book on this mind virus, and I point out it's a form of being blind. It's a psychic blindness, but it's a peculiar form of blindness that doesn't know it's blind, but actually thinks it's sighted and thinks it's more sighted than people who actually see. And in the Bible, they continually talk about this mind blindness, or this, that people have eyes but don't see, or a closed heart that's related to the mind blindness. And it's that turning away. It's becoming an ostrich and turning a blind eye. That is Wetiko. That is the mind virus in action. Because when you think about that, what is that an expression of? And it's an expression of that we're avoiding being in relationship to a part of ourselves. And, so on one hand, just to make it very, very simple, I think of Jung again. He goes, the whole future of humanity depends on the recognition and the integration of the shadow. But, that's such a cliche. Oh, I'm working on my shadow. But the shadow, it has multiple aspects. On the one hand, there's the personal aspect, my own stuff, that I've repressed or I'm not dealing with. But then there's the archetypal shadow. And the archetypal shadow, that's the realm of archetypal evil, of radical evil. And keep in mind, just to create context for what gives me the authority to talk and to write books about this, is that I had my own, unmediated direct encounter with evil, not just personal evil, but archetypal evil. And it almost totally drove me insane. Some people think that it did, which I'm fine with, but it just totally destroyed my entire family. It was like a pathogen got into the petri dish of my family and just consumed my entire family. So I haven't had a family for over 20 years. But I'm all good. I have a huge soul family and friend group and stuff. But the idea being that what Jung was also saying, a couple things was he was emphasizing the reality of evil, the reality of psychological evil. He wasn't talking as a metaphysician or a theologian. He was talking about that there's evil, there's something in the psyche that inspires us to enact self-destructive behavior, whether it's addiction or act out destructively towards other people in the world or collectively enact wars. And he called this morbid was the word he used, part of the personality that has a will to be ill. That's another phrase of his that was invested in just keeping us sick. So the closer we get to and I've experienced this, the closer I've gotten to my light, at the expressing who I am and all that, I notice there seems to be some sort of contrary adversarial force that, whose job it is to resist that and to try to stop that at all costs. But I've learned, instead of that seeing that as a problem, I've understood, that means I'm on the right path. That's actually built into the fabric of the universe. So what Jung was saying was that evil is like a major world power that's striding along the global stage, and that this Wetiko, he was very turned on to Wetiko. He didn't have the name for it, but in my work, I point out how he was like so completely pointing at Wetiko just in different ways. And he's basically saying, he's pointing out that hidden and coded within the evil that God might have placed, and this is like, pretty much a quote, this special purpose that evil is teaching us something. I mean, in answer to Job, his greatest work, he actually talks about that Satan was the godfather of humanity as a spiritual being. The idea being that the evil factor is helping us to wake up, is helping us to individuate. That's what I mean, that encoded in the mind virus, it's actually helping us to evolve. So the final thing is that when we recognize that evil is like a player on the world stage, what it's actually pointing at is the profound role that the psyche plays in creating our experiences in the world. And when we have that, that's a real expansion of consciousness.
No, it makes sense. But when you're talking about evil, because I'm sure you're aware of Jung and Bill W.'s correspondence, where Jung talks about that there is the archetypal evil, but then there's the shadow or the archons that we can integrate. But I think he told Bill W., this stuff you just got to get away from. There is no integrating evil, just like he told Roland Hazard. Only a religious experience will save you, nothing on earth. But do you feel there is this archetypal evil that we cannot integrate? It's just something
Yeah.
like, like an alcoholic. I have to avoid people, places, or things at all costs. There is no negotiating with the bar, going to the bar or toxic people.
Right, sure. Well, no, I definitely agree with that. I mean, I'm very aware of that letter of his correspondence with Bill W. when he says, only a real spiritual conversion experience. He also talks about that if we as an individual try to encounter evil, we'll just get devoured. He's pointing out the profundity of community, and that might, because Bill W. was the founder of AA, and the idea of Sangha in Buddhism, of community of other people who can really support us. And that's really important. But also in alchemy, there's a phrase called the terra damnata, the cursed earth. And what that means in the alchemical operation, there are certain elements that are so toxic and so poison, you can't invite them into the alchemical operation, or it'll corrupt the whole thing and everything will be tainted. And this is a real misunderstanding I see in the New Age movement, where people will have this lucidity and they'll be like, oh, I want to embrace everything and welcome everyone. And that's a beautiful thing to be all embracing and to invite in the darkness and the demons and all that. But you also have to have discernment that there is this, this factor that is so evil that if you invite it in, it's going to take down, it's going to just blow up the whole hermetic vessel. And then you're back at point one. So part of being all embracing, I point out, is to embrace the part of us that isn't embracing. It's a full embracing of all the parts, not just a one-sidedly, I'm going to embrace everything. That's too one-sided. It's like, what about the part of me that doesn't embrace and that needs to not embrace? I want to embrace that too.
Yeah, I agree. And going back to that lady, I think one of the misconceptions people have of the Gnostics is they, oh, well, they're so dualistic and world haters. And I'm like, no, there's beauty in their writings, but the Gnostics and the Manichaeans understood they wanted to put up the darkness and the light and put it right in front of you and say, this is reality. It is, the misterio tremendo, mysterium fascinante. We have to lift these two forces up, understand them in Taoism, and balance them out or integrate them.
Well, it reminds me, in because I wrote a book about quantum physics, and I have a chapter on singularity. Mm-hmm. And I point out that people think singularity, it's just formless and everything's one and there's no multiplicity. And I point out like a true singularity embraces, all the multiplicity, that it doesn't just negate it, but it actually it includes it. And people can easily see the multiplicity and go, oh, well, that's duality and that's not, a singularity or the true oneness. No, but the true oneness it embraces, all of the multiplicity as just being aspects or ornaments or adornments of the true oneness.
Yeah, I agree with you that one. So how can we see, or I like how you quote Philip K. Dick, and he has that term, what is the term? I have it right here. Negative hallucination, which is not that we're seeing something false, is that we don't even want to see reality.
Yeah.
What can we do to see better? I mean, people say, well, you say know thyself. That's easy to say, but what do you tell people when they really want to know themselves?
Yeah, and what Philip K. Dick was pointing at with the negative hallucination was that instead of seeing what's not there, we can't see what is there. So we turned a blind eye. And, in my work, I continually point out that Wetiko, the mind virus, it's a form of blindness. And as long as we don't see it, then it has free reign and power to act itself out through us, through our unconscious. And, and then we just offer ourselves as an instrument, through which, unbeknownst to us, the mind blindness, the mind virus, which is the blindness, it just puppeteers us. We become like a marionette on the string, and we're compulsively acting it out, and all the while we're just oblivious to it. So what I'm continually pointing out is the profound importance of seeing how this mind blindness, how this mind virus works, how it operates. So it's an inner disease of the soul, but somehow it has a magical ability to extend itself out into the world and configure outer events in our world so as to reflect and express the inner condition of a psyche under its thrall. So on the one hand, part of seeing this mind virus is to see how it operates, and informs and gives shape to the outer world to express itself. But concurrently, it also operates covertly through informing our reactions to when we encounter the evil in the world or the unconsciousness in the world. We then react. So it's non-local. It's not just bound in the outer or the inner, but it interfaces between the two. It couples the inner and the outer. So not only does it operate through the outside world, but it operates through our unconscious blind spots, through our own mind. And what I'm pointing out is when you begin to see that, how it operates outwardly, which reflects our inner unconscious reactions, it operates through our blind spots, through our unconscious, within our own minds. Then once we're able to see it, then by objectifying it in that way, the part of us that's seeing it is actually free of it. So that's a process where we more and more connect with our nature. Because here's the way it works, very, very simply. And in the apocryphal text of the Bible, they're pointing at Wetiko. They call it a counterfeiting spirit. Right. And this counterfeiting spirit, it puts us on, it fools us, but by putting us on like a suit of clothes, it actually offers us this false version of ourselves. Jung was saying the greatest danger facing humanity is to identify with what he calls a fictitious self. That's the mind virus. It'll offer us this version of ourselves. Oh, you're wounded, you're traumatized, you're limited. And if we're not awake and we identify with its version of ourselves, then it has us. Then it can manipulate it and control us. And think about what I just described. the thing about Wetiko, it can't steal our soul, but it tricks us into giving it away. Then we identify with who we're not. We forget who we actually are, our nature, and we disconnect from our creative agency, because Wetiko has no creativity on its own, but it plugs into our creative genius in a way that turns our own creative agency against us. And what I'm describing is a recipe for madness, and that's Wetiko in a nutshell. And that's playing out both individually, to the extent we're not awake, in each one of us, and then collectively, that's getting enacted writ large on the world stage.
Oh, it is indeed. Yeah. And when you're talking about, how it makes us blind to everything, it reminds me of Gurdjieff's Kunda buffer, that organ that's there to make us not see. Do you think, was this installed? Because some have said, I've had interviews with others said, at some point, we humans cannot see the whole truth. We're not allowed to see all of reality because we need to go hunting and have sex and eat and all that. So there is something that's keeping us from this, but at some point it's no longer good, this capability that
well, what
us.
what Gurdjieff also says is, like, our species, humanity, has fallen into I think his phrase is a hypnotic sleep. It's not just that we're asleep, is that there's some sort of, like, it's as if there's a malevolent factor in our psyches whose job it is to try to keep us asleep and stop us from waking up. And that's Wetiko. And I'm trying to point out that, in essence, because when you start to see it, that's when you start to take away its power from it, and you start to empower ourselves. And there has been, it's interesting, because the whole question of where did this Wetiko, this mind virus, where did it start? What's the origin of it?
Right.
And, and I've talked about this in my work, and whether it's, is it negative ETs or a trauma that happened collectively with the human species, centuries ago or whatever. And in my new book, the one that just came out a few days ago, I'm pointing out that, in my opinion, the origin, because what Jung says is very interesting. He says evil gets transmitted over the generations, so that it regenerates itself through us, we're like its purveyors. And I point out that, from my point of view, and I think it's the very first chapter in the book, is that the origin of the Wetiko mind virus is unhealed multi-generational ancestral trauma. And that because our species is in trauma, and when any of us, when we don't deal with that and heal that and integrate that, it then becomes rendered in our unconscious, such that we compulsively just act it out on the next of kin, and then traumatize the next generation. And then that just gets passed down like a psychic inheritance, until somebody, and it might as well be us, is able to stop being the link in the chain, and to heal and integrate their trauma, wounding, abuse, whatever you call it. But that seems to be, as far as I'm concerned, the origin of this, like, self and other destructive, sort of dynamic that we're continually acting out on ourselves and on each other.
Yeah, I used to read those passages, like in the Bible, that says you will be punished for the sins of the father. And the father said, "Oh, this is terrible." And I'm like, oh, that makes sense. It's ancestral trauma that's being passed down. The psychic damage is being passed down to all of us, and we have to deal with it. And of course, it's always challenging, because to deal with Wetiko, and people don't like to hear it, we all have a different path. What works for Paul Levy might not work for Miguel Connor. What works for, some people need therapy, some people shamanism, some people need to go to church. It's a different path for everybody, right?
Yeah, no, totally. Well, in the same way, like, when somebody's called to be a shaman, which you would never consciously choose, you'd have to be out of your mind, because the suffering is so overwhelming.
The
But
wounded
it's
healer,
always, it's all the wounded healer. Yeah, it's always conceived of as being a calling from the spirits or the higher dimension of our being. And, typically what'll happen if you're called, it's not just like, oh yeah, you go to another shaman and they just heal you. No, if you're called to be a shaman, you have to find your own one of a kind, unique path to, to actualize that calling and to step into that role, because it's just a role in the field of being a shaman. And I'm pointing out that we're all potential shamans in training, that the shamanic archetype is the major archetype that's activated in the collective unconscious of our species. And it's funny because there's a huge chapter in that new book on shamanism that I wrote. Literally, I finished it like a few weeks before the lockdown.
Right.
And little did I realize that I was being prescient, because I point out, oh, humanity is making a collective descent into the underworld of the unconscious. And then lo and behold, next thing I know, we're locked down and we've gone collectively mad and our freedoms are being taken away. And there are all these mandates and passports, and it was just wild. But, that, and then the shamanic archetype, I mean, that's correlated, like you were saying, with the healer who's wounded, with the wounded healer. And the idea is, and I totally relate to that, because I'm very in touch with my wound 24/7. And for years, I was just committed to getting rid of that wound. And then at a certain point, I began to realize, what if it never goes away? And that's the archetype of the wounded healer. They have an incurable wound, but there's a way of carrying it where it becomes a portal to connect you with your deeper creative powers. And also then there's not just the wounded healer, there's the healed healer. And it's like a paradox, because on the one hand, I'm an embodiment of the wounded healer, but on the other hand, there's like the healed healer part of me, which is like, no, I'm in touch with my nature. That's always pure and that's always healed and that's available right now. And at the same time, there's this wounding. But the danger is, if I identify fully with I'm wounded, being like a dream, I'm going to attract all the evidence confirming that identity. And then I'm colluding with my own victimization.
Yeah, makes sense. Vance, any questions from the audience or you?
Yes, we do have some questions. Domi wanted to ask if, Paul, you believe that Wetiko is integrated to the egoic vehicle, part of the inside, or is it an external thing? And if it's external, does it have its own free will?
Yeah. Well, okay, that's a great question. Like, so for example, a way I'll enter into that question is trying to explain or describe like the genesis of Wetiko in a personal scale. So say I'm whole, right? So I'm not traumatized. And then we all experience trauma. When I get traumatized, a part of my wholeness splits off. By definition, trauma is overwhelming. I can't integrate it. I can't symbolize it in the normal way. So I disassociate. I split. And that right away, me doing that consolates deep down the shamanic archetype, because the shaman is somebody who they go in search of that part of their soul that's gotten disassociated. And so, but in that splitting, in that I'm disassociating from that trauma. If I don't integrate that then in a way develops a seeming autonomy and independence of its own. So that split off part, I then experience it subjectively as if it's some sort of other, that has its own life and will, independent of my own ego. Oftentimes it's adversarial. Now, in psychology speak, that's what's called an autonomous complex. Indigenous people call that a demon. Okay, so you could say that's Wetiko. So the point is, we experience it subjectively as if it's some sort of entity, as if it's some sort of other, right? And yet, ultimately speaking, from the reality level, the absolute level, it's actually our own energy that just needs to be recognized and integrated, keeping in mind, but we subjectively experience it as if it's an entity. That's why whenever in my work I talk about the entity of Wetiko, I call it the seeming entity of Wetiko, because Wetiko, it doesn't even exist. There's no such thing at all. There has no independent intrinsic existence from its own side whatsoever, separate from our consciousness. And yet, even though it doesn't exist, it can kill us. You see, that's the paradox. And so when people hear about this mind virus, if they get all afraid, no, that's superfood for Wetiko. When we get into fear, that feeds Wetiko. The idea is to not get into fear, but to actually, like, it's a way of really understanding the nature of our experience. Because I think so many of us, oh, we have such great potential, but we're not actualizing our potential. Well, how come that is? And because keep in mind that Wetiko feeds into our creativity and it turns it against us, which is not answering the question. But the point is that it's getting creative. It's tapping into our creative genius, which we all interface with, which we all are actually these creative geniuses. That's really the solution for this psychic epidemic that we're facing.
Yeah, I can see that. That kind of leads to something I was wondering, which is, what about people who are our leaders and have some power in the society deliberately fostering these ideas, injecting the viruses, creating them in their laboratories, so to speak, and injecting them into the population. And then from there, what you just said happens, like people's imaginations catch it up. It propagates through, our collective nature, because we're, naturally forethinking. We're always looking ahead to the future to, try to survive and so forth, and looking out for things that might hurt us so we can avoid them. And then, so if we're being fed threats, which aren't even real, maybe, or maybe they're making them real. What about that scenario?
Yeah, well, I mean, I want to point out, you bring up a good point. I mean, so many people are unwitting instruments for Wetiko, but other people they're not unwitting. They're consciously creating stuff, because who knows why, but, I would imagine to feed their own, fantasies of power and control. And so there are people who are, generating, purposefully, this evil so as to, fragment people and take away their power and increase their own power. And, what you bring up, it makes me think of like the evil that's playing out in our world. And it's a perfect way. Like, for example, I'll just catapult into, like I had mentioned earlier in this interview, in the collected works, Jung was pointing at Wetiko, and he had a number of different names. He called it totalitarian psychosis. That was the name he used the most. Now, think about what Wetiko is. It's an inner disease of the soul that actually reveals itself and plays itself out via the medium of the outside world. So when Wetiko gets into an individual person's psyche, what does it do? It colonizes the psyche. It hijacks the executive function. It creates a shadow government. It dictates to the ego. All the healthy parts of the psyche get subsumed and begin to be in service to the pathogen, to the Wetiko mind virus. Okay, what I'm describing, that's an inner condition of a psyche under the thrall of Wetiko. Think about what's playing out in the world with all the fascism and totalitarian forces that are taking over our planet. That's actually reflecting the dynamic in an individual psyche when this mind virus starts to take over the psyche. And then the person so taken over, the regulatory, sort of agencies, the self-monitoring system of the psyche get captured, just like the regulatory agencies in our government have gotten captured by the very invaders they're supposed to be monitoring. It's all, you see, the outer and the inner are reflecting each other. And when you begin to see that, that's to begin to see the dreamlike nature. Because in a dream, you recognize, oh yeah, when I'm in a dream, the outer dreamscape is reflecting what's happening inside of my psyche. The outer is the inner. This is, so many mystical traditions talk about this. And so that actually helps you to recognize the Wetiko mind virus when you see the correlation with the inner and the outer. It helps you recognize the dreamlike nature. And when you recognize the dreamlike nature, that's to see through the imagination that we exist as a separate self, which we don't exist as a separate self. That's the illusion. That, in a sense, is Wetiko. And when you see through that illusion, you recognize we're interdependent and we're interconnected. And then all of a sudden you've expanded your awareness and your identity, and that energetically gets expressed with compassion and love. And that's the kryptonite to Wetiko. So you see, all of this is interrelated, and Jung was super switched on to that,
Yes, he was indeed. Any other questions, Vince?
Yeah, we got one more. Corey T wanted to know um, if you've collaborated with any Native American tribes or elders on concrete steps to alleviate Wetiko effects of paralyzing quantities of humanity.
Yeah. So I'm very open to that. And there was one Native American, he came all the way from the East Coast. He drove to meet me because he had read my work on Wetiko. I think he had read The Spelling Wetiko, the first of the 3 books. And he so wanted, from his point of view, when he was a medicine man, he wanted to just meet me in person, not just having read my work. And then he literally drove out, the 3,000 miles, and I invited him over. We had a cup of tea. And then, he just wrote me a beautiful endorsement, I think, for the second Wetiko book. And, and I think he recognized in me that I was just somebody who went through an unbelievable trauma, a direct encounter with evil. And instead of it just destroying me or closing my heart or hurting my awareness, that I was able to come through that with some sort of a gift, with an articulation of what I had experienced. And I'm really open to more, because I'm not trying to appropriate the Native American terminology, but I'm really trying to honor it. And as a Western modern person, I'm more like trying to translate this incredible wisdom of this indigenous wisdom into a psychological idiom that can really speak, to modern Western people. Because what I'm pointing at and what the Native Americans were pointing at, and every spiritual tradition is pointing at Wetiko in their own way. I mean, in the Castaneda books, Don Juan, Carlos's teacher, calls it, this is the topic of topics. There's nothing more important than this. If we don't recognize that there's something within each of our human psyches, that is actually, causing us to self-destruct. If we don't recognize that, then we're doomed, and then nothing else will matter. That's what I mean. That's what Don Juan in the Castaneda books means when he says this. He doesn't have the name Wetiko. He's talking about, he calls it the predator. Yeah. This is the topic of topics for shamans.
Yeah, that's for sure. I would certainly agree. And I think an important thing that gets looked over today, or that we suffer for it, and you talk about in your book, is that of cancel culture and being triggered. And you related to the Tibetan issue called Shempa, and that of having a lion gaze. Maybe could you share so the audience can get those tools, sure, not to get drawn in on the internet?
Yeah. No, totally. So on the one hand, when Wetiko is in the room, so to speak, all of a sudden it's not safe to speak. So it cuts your vocal cords. Oh, if you speak what's true, if you actually shine light on the darkness, if you express your experience, and it's not along the agreed upon consensus reality, like, narrative, you get canceled. You get, deplatformed, demonetized. And then what happens, that outer process, when that's the world you live in, it becomes internalized inside of your mind, and it gets rendered unconscious to the point where you then become your own control system, and you shut down your own voice without even knowing you're doing it. And then you become, the greatest poison in the human psyche is unexpressed creativity. So then that just poisons your system, So on the one hand, there's that. On the other hand, there's the getting triggered. And, with a lot of like the whole woke thing where, we can't have anybody triggered or offended. And I would point out, what's wrong with being triggered? Why not? But the point is, there's nothing wrong with being triggered. That's not Wetiko. But where Wetiko comes in is, what do we do once we're triggered? What most people do, if somebody out there is triggering them, they see the problem is out there. Oh, if only you would stop doing that or saying that, then I wouldn't be triggered, and then I'll be back to being okay. So like the source of the problem is out there. And in Tibetan, in Tibetan Buddhism, they have that name, that word Shenpa, for being triggered, but they also have this incredible teaching called having the gaze of the lion's gaze. And what that means, and I talk about this in my work, is like, when I was describing the ordinary person being triggered, it's like when you have a stick and you throw it with the dog runs after the stick. That's like the ordinary person. They get triggered and they run after the stick like the problem is what's triggering them. And if only that would stop, they would feel better. But in Tibetan Buddhism, they say, no, be like the lion. When you throw a stick with a lion, instead of like a dog running after the stick, the lion runs after you. Be like the lion. When you get triggered, immediately train yourself. That's an incredible opportunity to just self-reflect on what inside of you has been triggered. And all of a sudden you have an opportunity to shed light on a part of your unconscious. And it's taking responsibility for your own experience. And because in that moment of being triggered, there is something that's unintegrated in you. That's like, coming to the fore, that's been hiding. And all of a sudden there it is. And what an incredible opportunity to bring that to awareness. And so that's the idea of having the gaze of the lion. And that I talk about that. It's a major chapter in the book about being in relationships, just with intimate relationships, with friends, with the human family, because being in a relationship is pretty much the main vector, the main way that Wetiko operates and plays itself out. And we've all experienced this, say you're friends with someone and everything's harmonic and zen and chill and all great. And all of a sudden something will happen. Somebody will say something, there'll be a misunderstanding. And then it opens up the door for hurt and separation. And you could even get divorced or whatever. And it's as if behind the scenes is the Wetiko bug just feasting on the separation and just being in ecstatic bliss that it's split up, and it's interesting, the word sort of diabolic, which is related to Wetiko, because it's very sort of devilish. Etymologically, diabolic means that which separates. And the antonym and the antidote for diabolic is symbolic, and symbols are the language of dreams. And I keep on talking about that when we see the dreamlike nature of reality, that we're having a collective dream, and that this dream is an oracle and it's speaking symbolically. That's why both Jung and Christ, one of the things they were both, and I talk about this in the new book, they both were trying to bring in symbolic awareness, seeing this as a dream and interpreting it as such. And when we develop symbolic awareness, once again, that's kryptonite to Wetiko.
Yeah, you even write in your book, in the chapter on Rudolf Steiner, you say, or you quote Steiner saying, the symbol prepares the soul to receive the truth from the spiritual world. And of course, you talk about both Steiner and Jung are telling us we must be Christ. In other words, we must go down into the underworld and release the souls from Hades and be more Christ-like in a symbolic way, right?
Yeah, well, with Steiner, I have a chapter on Steiner's work, and he was so, it blew my mind. He was saying the greatest event of our time is he called it the incarnation of the etheric Christ. So he was pointing out, instead of Christ incarnating through one person, like he did 2,000 years ago, now, the divine is incarnating through the human species, through the collective unconscious. But because it's instead of 2,000 years ago, the appointed vessel was kept pure and white and light, and all the darkness was outside, and isn't it interesting that coincidentally, right when Christ appeared, there was Satan. Right at the same moment, it was as if they were expressing the polarization that existed in the collective unconscious 2,000 years ago, and I'm kind of intermingling Steiner and Jung, but what Jung was saying was that, as God gets closer to humanity, and that the vessel for the incarnation is now creaturely man, to quote Jung, who's tainted with original sin and with darkness, this involves a close encounter with evil. And what Steiner, so this creates context for the Wetiko epidemic we're in the middle of. And what Steiner was saying is, the greatest event is the incarnation of the etheric Christ. But before we can actualize that, we have to encounter, in his words, the beast. And the beast is radical evil. And in a way, that's because after Christ got resurrected, after Christ got crucified, people typically hear about the resurrection, but they don't hear about the 3 days in between where Christ descended into the underworld. And in a sense, that's the shamanic descent that we're all making into the realm of darkness. And the great danger is to get caught there and absorbed there and identified. But the idea is, if we are actually open to that underworld and are able to still keep in touch with our nature as light, our transcendental nature that's already awake, then that journey into the underworld becomes a portal into the resurrected body, into the rainbow body, into our true nature. It's all just metaphoric in a certain way of describing that we actually remember who we are. Because the point that you see, it's so wild, because there's such a sense of pessimism and despair about what's happening, understandably, because things just
Right.
so dark and people feel so helpless. But the truth of the matter, and this is really inspiring, is that we already have the solution. Each one of us, we are the solution. We have this incredible creative agency and power at our disposal, but we're using it unconsciously in a way that's creating a cocoon around us and is suffocating us. And what I'm trying to bring forth is that, no, we already have what we need. We're these creative geniuses, but we don't realize it. And it's helpful when you hang out with other people who are tuning into that and who are embodying that. That becomes contagious. That can go viral, that realization. And that's what my whole work is about, because then you discover, oh yeah, we can hang out with other people in a way where we can literally dream ourselves awake. We can activate our collective genius in a way that we don't have access to as an isolated individual person. And we can actually get in sync with each other, and we can literally dream a different dream. I'm talking about the waking dream. And this is to consciously participate in our own evolution. This isn't some new age woo theory. Quantum physics completely backs this up, and I can talk about that in a bit. And
Sure.
this is the good news, and this is what's available to us, and this is what my whole work is trying to bring across. And it can create incredible inspiration for people to really, to tune into this.
Beautifully said. Yeah, backing up a little reminds me of what Jung also once said. He obviously talked a lot about evil, but he did say once, evil is not allowing people to tell their stories. And I always tell people, you have a story, you have something within you, a myth, a purpose. So, but yeah, this society is very hard to tell our stories because they want us to conform to a grand narrative, or they just don't want us to upset the apple cart. So I think Jung was
Right. And it's interesting, the shaman, one way of describing the shaman, they're the archetypal storyteller, that's the dreaming. They're the dreamers. We're all the dreamers. And another way of describing the shaman is that they're the creative artist. And so if there's an energy in the field that's oppressing us telling our story, I mean, to think about me, how I came to my work, I was just an ordinary kid, mainstream, studying math and economics in college. And then I got switched on to that I was a creative artist. And without going into the story, my father did everything he could to obliterate that impulse, because he had a vision of me of being, the doctor or lawyer.
Yeah.
And here I was realizing, no, I'm being called to be the creative artist. And the point I want to bring out, though, is that, yeah, if it's the true creative impulse, it can't be kept down for long. So at first, it really was a big problem for me, having my creative expression so oppressed. But then I found another way. It wasn't going to be kept down for long, because it was so related to my soul's purpose for being here.
No, makes sense. Makes sense. Well, why don't tell us about quantum physics, something you do spend a lot of time in
Yeah.
dreaming
Sure.
with.
So
How does it relate to Wetiko?
yeah. Oh, quantum physics is offering us the medicine for Wetiko. So, before quantum physics came on the scene, a little bit over 100 years ago, the classical Newtonian physicists conceived of this world as existing objectively, and they were just passively trying to study and understand the world. And then quantum physics emerged into our world and into the human psyche. And like this real simple way of describing it is that quantum physics proved that the act of observing this universe actually influenced the universe observed. Now, of course, that's a description of a dream, that, when we're perceiving whatever dream we're having, our act of perceiving the dream is influencing the dream, because they're not two separate things. So quantum physics was actually discovering the dreamlike nature of the universe, though the typical quantum physicists, they're not trained for that. So it's still controversial. I mean, it's there's no debate at all that it's the greatest discovery ever in the history of this planet in the realm of science. Nobody will argue that. But where all the controversy is what does it mean, the discoveries of quantum physics? And I'm pointing out, yeah, it means that, it's discovering the dreamlike nature. In other words, to say it even simpler, that the act of observation is creative, okay? And that each moment, by the way we interpret our experience and the meaning we place on our experience, is actually creating our experience. There's no one else doing that. We're doing that. We are creating our experience each and every moment. So to take it the next step, here's, I'll just connect a couple dots, and this is a real essentialization of my book on quantum physics, that if we think the universe exists objectively, we are at the same moment dreaming ourselves up to be a subject who's in relationship to that object, because as a subject, we need an object to be in relationship to in order to be a subject. Right. But once quantum physics comes along and says, hey, there is no such thing as an objective anything, then all of a sudden, what happened to the subject? All of a sudden, that becomes really a major question. That's where quantum physics has promoted itself to be a spiritual path, because it's actually pointing at who are we. But the idea is that experience of being a subjective reference point existing in space and time, i.e. an ego, and an objective world reciprocally co-arise and reinforce each other. That's the illusion. It's an illusion generating an illusion. And if we don't see the initial illusion, then we get caught and we get into a whole hall of mirrors of other illusions. But to take it the next step, what quantum physics is saying in essence is that they'll talk about these elementary quantum particles that exist in a state of potentiality, of any and every way they could potentially manifest. They manifest in a state of potential up until the moment of observation. Then along comes an observer, and it observes that quantum entity, and then one of those possibilities actualizes into form, and all the others just disappear into the void as if they never existed, as if they've all gone into different parallel worlds. But the point is that even if that one potentiality that's actualized, or that could potentially actualize, even if it's, to quote a quantum physicist, ridiculously highly unlikely, it could still be the very universe that manifests this in this very moment. The point being, to bring it down to mundane reality, the idea, the possibility of humanity actually awakening in this moment, quantum physics is saying if that's possible, and that could be this very next moment. And so that gives us incredible hope. The point is, so many people get caught by pessimism and think, oh no, we're doomed. And by holding that pessimistic, despairing, depressed point of view, they're unwittingly making that more likely. And they're actually part of the problem. But when you see, wait a second, it's within the realm of possibility. It's like we've had a recurring dream again and again, and we've been to this exact moment a million times before, and we've always blown ourselves up. Well, maybe this is the recurring dream where we actually, as a species, awaken and avert that catastrophe and actually dream ourselves awake. Quantum physics says that's actually possible. And if you're not like envisioning that, then what in the world are you thinking?
Exactly. Yeah, you got to have the right attitude. Well, as we are getting towards the end of the interview, it's a Memorial Weekend, and we all got stuff to do. I think there's one last chat or question there, Vance.
Yep. How should we understand fate in this world? Should we try to break the matrix?
Yeah. Well, I think about, so fate, it's interesting. Fate is related to, there's a phrase, daimon, and the daimon is the guiding spirit or the inner voice, and it's related to our fate. And the daimon is related to our genius, to our muse, to our calling, hearing a voice, to our vocation. The idea is when we connect with our daimon, we find what we're here to do, and we find our voice, and we find ourselves, and we find our mission. And encoded in that daimon is the creative spirit. But if we don't connect with that daimon, it becomes a demon. Okay. And the idea is this, that I think about quantum physics. Quantum physics, you see, before quantum physics, the physicists were thinking, if we knew enough of the variables, we could figure out this is a mechanistic, deterministic universe, and we can figure out what's going to happen. But quantum physics comes along and says, no, this is not a deterministic universe. There's no fate that's written in stone. That's an expired idea. This is a probabilistic universe. That what's going to happen. They say the best way to predict the future is to create it. Okay, so being that our universe, like for example, are we going to kill ourselves, because of the Wetiko mind virus and just destroy the biosphere and enact collective suicide and destroy our species? Or are we going to actually evolve and wake up? The choice is ours. It's actually in our hands. Okay. And it depends how we're going to dream it. We're having a collective dream. How are we going to dream it? It's not written in stone. That's really, really important. And that creates, or that puts an enormous responsibility on each one of us. Okay. So that would be the way I would answer that question.
Okay. Sometimes though, isn't it like say you're in a train with an irresponsible engineer who's driving the train too fast on the tracks. And, I wake up and say, this train's going too fast on the tracks. And maybe I can try to get hold of the conductor who is actually in charge of the train and tell him that. But he says, nope, I don't know. So, he doesn't listen to me. What do we do in those situations? I mean, I could jump off the train, but it's going too fast. I could try to arouse the other passengers, but they're all sleeping, and I'm playing the devil's advocate, so to speak here.
Yeah,
but,
no, totally.
Plato's train instead of Plato's cave.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, I talk about that. I say, imagine we're in a car and the driver is drunk and asleep and blind and going over a cliff. And what do you do? What do you do? And it's so interesting because it makes me think, with like the whole thing with the British are coming, like Paul Revere. Like I feel, and I think a lot of us can relate to this, I really try my best to track the horror and the evil and the insanity that's playing out. And there's an aspect of it that's really dangerous and really scary. And it's interesting, like trying, like Paul Revere, hey, the British are coming. Some people have said to me, oh, you're just creating fear by, because fear is the superfood of the mind virus. But when there's fear by the mainstream media, it all of a sudden we become paralyzed and immobilized and, we feel helpless. So let's just make the best of it. And then we're colluding with the evil. But like with Paul Revere going, the British are coming. If people get afraid, it mobilizes them into action. And that's like a positive thing. So, and the idea of, how do you wake people up? I mean, I think of Jung. He says, to preach the light to people whose eyes are blind makes no sense. It's a much better strategy to teach people the art of seeing. And of course, how do you do that? That's a whole other question. And I imagine so many of us can relate to, you see people who are asleep and you try to wake them up and it has the opposite effect. They just think you're nuts or, you're a conspiracy theory. And now there's a separation and it's ruined their friendship or whatever. So, that's a real question. Like, how do you actually intervene in the dream in a sense and wake people up, particularly if we're in a train and the driver of the train is like driving us right over this cliff? Like, what do we do? And keep in mind, there are people with their hands on the levers of power, who don't have our best interests at heart and who are psychopathic, and I don't think there's any argument about that, but not to forget that we have this incredible agency. That's what I'm trying to embody. We have this incredible creative power and it's contagious and it can go viral, like I've been suggesting. And, So I'm just, trying to dream into that and actually actualize that scenario.
Well said. Awesome. Well, I know we just got another one, but we're going to have to wrap it up because I know Paul has to go. Esoteric Fairy Tales, we'll
Kudos.
get to your question next time. Just advice for people struggling to release their creative voice. I'd say know yourself, Paul.
Yeah. Let me just. Well, I can answer that if you guys have a minute. Yeah. Because it's such a. I can't say enough about the profundity of and the importance of stepping into our creative voice. And I'm in private practice, and everybody I work with, pretty much, I almost like a heat-seeking missile. I always get down to what's stopping you from being creative. And we all have a story of like, oh, well, I'm not good enough, or I got criticized when I was younger, or I might get rejected, I might get ridiculed, it won't be perfect. But we're investing that story with reality, and so what I try to bring people to is what in the present moment, what is that experience like? You feel like you want to create something, you want to give voice to something, to your creative expression. And then what is your experience like in that moment, and really slowing that down. And you see, it's not a problem at all if there's this incredible negative voice and it's adversarial and, oh, you're not good enough, and, oh, it's painful, you shouldn't do that, or whatever. That's not problematic in the slightest. The problem is, what do? Do you invest it with reality, with power over you? That's you're then colluding, you're complicit with shutting down your own voice, you see. And so that's where I would really unlock that. And then there is so many ways and times during each and every day where we are, even in the most subtle way, expressing our creativity. Maybe the way we're washing our dishes, or the way we're walking, or whatever. And it's just a sense of becoming familiar. You see, okay, I'll just wrap this up by, like, we hear about our true nature. Oh, because it is the best protection against Wetiko, against the mind virus, against evil, is to be connected with your nature. What is your nature? What does that mean? It's such a cliche. Well, our nature, our true nature, by its nature, is creative. And so when you connect and remember and recognize and embody your true nature, you express yourself and embody being creative. And the more you express yourself and embody being creative, the deeper you realize your nature. It's a positive feedback loop in which you're actually like tapping into the 0 point of creation. You're tapping into the creative source of everything, and you're literally creating light upon light. And so maybe that might be just a nice offering as far as a way of answering that last question.
Good answer. Very
Thanks,
inspirational. Awesome. Well, we're at the end. I certainly highly advise you definitely get Undreaming Wetiko. So much more in this book that will be very helpful and insightful to see this mind virus. And people want to get to know more about you. What's your website for those listening on audio?
Yeah, if people want to awaken in the dream, they should just go to awakeninthedream.com. And that's my website. It's not monetized hardly at all, because this is information I want to get out. So, there's a ton of articles, ton of interviews and videos and stuff, all for free. I'm just wanting, people to read this stuff because it's medicine. It really helps people. And then, you can buy an autographed book or set up a session. That's different. But that would be the way that people, could connect with my work. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, it's in the show notes for YouTube. It'll be in the show notes when we release the audio version in a day or two. And I'll definitely check it out. And yeah, for those of you in the chat room, thank you very much for your questions and your support, and a little bit of drama from what I see. And Vance, thanks for keeping us company and keeping the Wetiko out of the chat room.
Yeah, it's not always easy, but no, we care about everybody in the chat room.
Yeah.
Don't want to exclude everybody, but we got to keep the chat room on topic.
There you go. Well, Paul, thank you very much for once again coming on AM Byte, and good luck with the book. And thanks for taking all this time to give us this great gnosis.
Yeah, I so appreciate it. Really, just can't thank you enough, guys. Thank you so much.
All right, everybody, have a good week and have a good day. And as I say, write your own gospel, live your own myth. Until the next one, take care, everybody.